Close your eyes for a moment and imagine London in the year 1720. The air smells of coal fires and damp stone. Horse-drawn carriages rattle over uneven cobblestones. Gentlemen in powdered wigs walk briskly through the narrow streets, while merchants shout prices for bread, candles, and cloth. But there is something else in the air, something stronger than the smoke from chimneys. A fever of wealth. Everywhere you go, in the taverns, in the coffee houses, even in the quiet corners of churches, people whisper the same name: the South Sea Company. It promised gold and silver from distant lands. It promised profits beyond imagination. And within just a few months, it would create one of the first great speculative bubbles in financial history, and one of the loudest crashes. This is the story of the South Sea Bubble. To understand the bubble, we need to begin with England's debts. The early 1700s were a time of almost constant war. The long and expensive War of the Spanish Succession had left Britain drowning in obligations. The government owed enormous sums to creditors, merchants, and soldiers. Into this world came a new idea. Why not turn the burden of debt into an opportunity for profit? The South Sea Company was created in 1711 for exactly that reason. It would take over large portions of the government's debt. In exchange, it received bonds, interest payments, and most importantly, a royal monopoly on trade with South America, the so-called South Seas. In reality, the promise was shaky. Spain controlled most of South America, and Britain had little chance to trade freely there. But to the public, this monopoly sounded like a key to unimaginable riches: treasure fleets, silver mines, exotic goods. And so, from the very beginning, the South Sea Company was less about trade and more about a story of hope. The company promoted itself with dazzling promises. Pamphlets and speeches spoke of ships sailing to distant lands, bringing back spices, gold, and silver. Politicians supported the plan, not only because they believed in it, but because they themselves invested in it. By 1720, the company struck a huge deal with Parliament. Holders of government debt could exchange it for South Sea Company shares. In one stroke, the company was tied to the very heart of England's financial system. And that is when the fever began to rise. Coffee houses in London became the centers of speculation. Men gathered with newspapers and rumors, whispering about the next rise in the company's shares. Women, who rarely took part in investing before, began to use their savings. Even servants, farmers, and small shopkeepers scraped together coins to buy a chance at riches. The vision was so powerful, so intoxicating, that reality no longer mattered. The South Sea stock began to climb. At first slowly, £100 a share, then £200. But the excitement grew. By spring of 1720, shares reached £500. By summer, they soared to over £1,000. Everywhere, fortunes seemed to appear overnight. People who had lived modest lives suddenly found themselves boasting of wealth. Nobles, politicians, bishops, all were invested. Even King George I himself was a shareholder. The company's directors encouraged the frenzy. They offered easy credit for investors. You could buy shares now and pay later. Pamphlets spread fantastic predictions of profits. Some said the South Sea trade would bring wealth greater than all of Europe combined. The fever spread beyond the company itself. Dozens of bubble companies appeared. Some promised to build machines for perpetual motion. Others offered trade with remote islands. One infamous company described itself only as a company for carrying on an undertaking of great advantage, but nobody to know what it is. People laughed, but they still invested. It was mania, pure and unstoppable. For ordinary Londoners, the bubble was not just numbers. It was life. Shopkeepers closed their shops to rush to the exchange. Servants and sailors sold their few possessions to buy a single share. Newspapers were filled with stock prices instead of politics. In coffee houses, arguments raged. Was the price too high? Could it rise even further? Some people became rich in days. Stories spread of a butcher who sold his knives and became a gentleman, or a maid who invested her wages and bought herself a carriage. But others warned. How could the company earn so much from trade when there were no real ships, no real profits? Their voices were drowned in the rush. It was a dream, and dreams do not last forever. By late summer of 1720, the dream began to fade. The price had risen too high, too fast. The company had little actual business, and whispers began to spread. Whispers of corruption, of directors selling their own shares, of the profits being nothing but paper illusions. The first cracks appeared. Some investors quietly sold their shares, taking profits. Others followed. And then panic set in. The price fell from £1,000 to £700, then to £500, then lower, and lower still. Investors rushed to sell, but buyers disappeared. Fortunes that had seemed solid one week melted away the next. Even the greatest minds were caught. Sir Isaac Newton, who had at first made a profit, returned to the market during the height of the mania. When the crash came, he lost the equivalent of millions. He later said, "I can calculate the motions of heavenly bodies, but not the madness of men." By the end of the year, thousands were ruined. Some families lost everything. Banks and merchants collapsed. The entire nation felt the shock. The South Sea bubble left deep scars. Parliament launched investigations. Many of the company's directors were disgraced. Some were imprisoned, their estates seized. Politicians were accused of corruption. Even King George I had to distance himself from the scandal. The public's trust was shattered. For years after, people avoided stocks altogether. The word South Sea became a warning, a symbol of greed, deception, and ruin. And yet, in the long run, Britain survived. The Bank of England stepped in to stabilize the system. New rules were introduced to prevent reckless speculation. Slowly, the financial system rebuilt itself, stronger than before. The bubble also left behind lessons that echo through every crisis that came later. The dot-com bubble of the 2000s, the mortgage bubble of 2008, even the sudden rise and fall of modern cryptocurrencies. The South Sea bubble reminds us that speculation is a fire. It warms us when it begins, but burns us when it rages out of control. And so, as London's streets returned to their rhythm, the fever of 1720 faded. The carriages rolled once more, the coffee houses calmed, and people returned to their ordinary lives, but poorer, sadder, and wiser. The South Sea bubble was not the last financial scandal, far from it. But it was one of the first to show, in vivid detail, how money, hope, and greed can mix into something unstoppable, until it shatters. As you drift into sleep, remember, history is not just about kings and battles. It is also about the markets, about trust, and about the dreams we chase. And sometimes, the dreams that vanish. Close your eyes now. Let the noise of the markets fade. Let the lessons of 1720 become quiet whispers in the night. Good night, and sleep well.